We will halve inflation, grow the economy, reduce debt.
Nothing's changed. The circus moves on, rinse and repeat.
We have an opportunity to become Europe's Silicon Valley.
We can perhaps be a broker of some sort with Ukraine.
We expect inflation to come off quite rapidly in the rest of this year. Obviously, we want to see that happen.
What we now need is a period of stable, quiet, serious government.
You're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Yuan Potts.
And I'm Caroline Hepker. Welcome to the programme. So, Yuan, we're skipping Prime Minister's questions today because we have government ministers coming out of our ears. We're going to be hearing from Gareth Davies, who is the Exchequer Secretary to the Treasury, plus the Farming Minister, Mark Spencer.
Yeah, really interesting bit of news today. It's a call from David Miles, Chief Forecaster at the UK's Office of Budget Responsibility. He says that contrary to what you might expect, a shrinking population, which of course we very much don't have at the moment, but we might well have in the future, along with a lot of other countries in Europe, could actually be good for living standards. And he gives the example of Japan, which has already seen its population fall by 4 million, admittedly to still a pretty large 124 million, where a lot of the eco data has been poor, GDP's been growing slowly, and there's been lots of concern over that. But he says the reality is that living standards in Japan have actually held up pretty well.
Living standards. And I think that's really crucial and crucial to all the conversations we're having with government. No, I did think I agree, it was a very interesting bit of research. So the idea fundamentally is that if your population is decreasing and ageing, then you're going to end up being poorer. You have fewer people who are of working age and fit and out there doing the jobs to then support the older population. But David Miles is sort of turning that on its head and actually saying that it costs you so much money to build new schools, new hospitals, new roads, etc., for all of the youngsters that you might have in the economy, that actually may outweigh, the issues of an ageing population, which was quite different thinking. Most people stick to this economic adage that demographics is destiny.
Yeah, and he undoes some of this thinking, which, as you say, is very much the consensus. And he says that Britain has not collectively invested enough to keep many of its capital assets, schools, the rail network, roads, etc., at a level that can keep up with the demands from that ever-rising population. So he says that although GDP, that top-line number, may be increasing, although it didn't in July as we're here, if you share that out amongst people and look at the resources we have to use, and we're not building those resources, that's a problem.
It is, but I still don't think it's fundamentally a great argument, is it? That you're not investing enough to keep up with the numbers of people that you have in your country, or whichever country it is. That's still not a particularly good argument, is it? You should try to invest for the future, as it were. And also, I think that Miles points out this idea that it's also that people are putting off having children till later because the costs are so unbelievably high. The cost of childcare and just raising a family is so expensive. Again, I think that's generally a really, really negative kind of damning point. But anyway, to the point around GDP that you make, I want to pick up on that because it's actually where we started with Gareth Davies, the Exchequer Secretary to the Treasury. So we got the monthly GDP data out today. This was for July. So bit by bit, it gave us a little bit more information. Effectively, the wet weather and the strikes meant that we did a lot worse than most economists had expected. And the UK economy shrank by 0.5%.
Yeah, this is another bit of disappointing data. Yesterday, we had the jobs numbers and unemployment rose on the month. And today, yes, it's disappointing GDP data. I have to say that the GDP numbers in June were actually rather good. But it does seem like there is momentum building, that the UK economy is losing steam, as you would expect, given the interest rates. So this is useful for the Bank of England, but it's not great news for the UK economy. Well, we talked about these numbers and the outlook for the economy with Exchequer Secretary to the Treasury, Gareth Davies.
The data out today has been explained by the ONS as being as a result of two one-off factors. One is the wet weather in that particular month. That's hurt retail sales by about 1.2%, which is down, and also construction. So that is one factor. And as you allude to, the other factor is industrial action, particularly in the healthcare sector, and we've seen a drag on growth as a result of health sector output. So I think it's important to, one, identify what has caused today's figures, but two, put it in the context of the overall picture, which is that, the end of Q2 growth was up unexpectedly by some estimates, but also the IMF, as you alluded to as well, has upgraded significantly their growth forecast for the UK. The Bank of England have said that we're going to avoid a recession, and the ONS revised their previous analysis to say that we were one of the fastest growing economies out of the pandemic. So it is important to put this data out today in the context of the overall picture.
Yeah, context is obviously important, and the forecasts are accurate. But Gareth, what is your level of confidence that we are not in the foothills of a recession right now here in the UK?
Well, I remember not so long ago, a lot of the forecasters were saying that we'd be in a recession by now, and that hasn't happened. As I say, I think the IMF, the Bank of England, and the OBR have all upgraded their forecasts for growth. For the Treasury, for the government, what we are doing is, seeking to ensure that we stimulate growth through our active policies. So whether it's workforce participation, as you saw at the budget with the childcare reforms.
Still 2.6 million people who have healthcare issues who have not returned. 2.6 million people, Gareth. And that's linked to the NHS and the failures in the NHS. You have to fix the NHS to get some of those people back. 2.6 million people.
So what I was going to say is we are taking decisive action to increase workforce participation, but also trying to unblock some of the issues for those who want to work to be able to work. So we're piloting various schemes, for example, to help the disabled and those with long-term health issues by providing extra support to them to get them into the workforce, because we recognise that we want to, there's more work to do to get people back into the workforce. We, clearly have a post-pandemic situation in the NHS where we need to clear the backlog of appointments. The industrial action is not helping that, and we've been very clear. The industrial action has caused, I think, nearly 900,000 appointments to be cancelled, and so we are very clear about that. That is not something that we agree with, and is clearly having an impact. But overall, I think the employment record is strong. Unemployment is still lower than most of our international competitors, and payroll employment is still at record highs. So again, context is important.
Yeah, I mean, but that's part of the problem for the UK, isn't it? It's that is fueling inflation. The Bank of England, though, expects Britain to stagnate basically for much of the next 2 years. So maybe, we aren't in recession, but we're certainly bumping along the bottom, and that is the fundamental issue for Britain. It's actually raising long-term economic growth. It's not much to celebrate if the next 2 years are going to be stagnant and living standards are under continued enormous pressure.
Well, the thing that we've got to do is, as I've said many times before, the top priority, the thing we've got to do is cut inflation. We've got to get inflation down, because that acts as a drag on growth. And the Prime Minister, the Chancellor, I have been very clear that is our number one priority. We've got to make sure that what we do in the Treasury, fiscal policy, is aligned with monetary policy, that we support the Independent Bank of England to tame inflation and get it down.
Do you have to start cutting, though? Is the triple lock on UK pensions going? I mean, it looks like William Hague has basically taken the heat from the Prime Minister by calling for the pensions guarantee to be ditched. The IFS that we were speaking to only yesterday saying that it's going to cost an extra £2 billion more than budgeted. £2 billion. That's not insignificant given how little headroom the Treasury has. Is the pensions triple lock just toast?
Well, we're committed to the triple lock. Since we introduced it, I think 200,000 pensioners have been brought out of absolute poverty. About 12.5 million people in this United Kingdom rely on it and use it as a foundation for their retirement. What we want to do is ensure that we provide security and dignity in retirement, while also ensuring that the system that we put in place is fair and sustainable. And we're very clear that we're committed to the triple lock.
Gareth, you talk about the Bank of England, and of course it operates with its independent policy and framework. I just wonder how concerned you and the team are at the Treasury about what's happening in the property market here as we see those rates increase. And yesterday we had a story on the Bloomberg about UK mortgage arrears hitting a 7-year high. It is really starting to impact households now. Are you worried about a property crisis here in the UK?
Well, we monitor this extremely carefully, as you would expect, and the Chancellor has made a number of different announcements, not least the Mortgage Charter recently, where he brought together mortgage providers to ensure that help is provided in a very meaningful way to those who are struggling to pay their mortgages. But as he has also said, key to this is I'm afraid, getting inflation down so that rates can come down, and that will obviously help the housing market in turn. So a lot of this comes down to the number one priority and number one issue that we face, which is inflation, which is causing higher rates. We want to see that come down so that rates can come down, and the housing
You're not seeing a crisis point for an inflection point for this property market?
We monitor it very carefully, as you'd expect.
How can you change the minds of voters between now and the next general election? Labour's 20 points ahead. We were speaking to Labour Shadow Business and Trade Secretary only a few days ago, Jonathan Reynolds, making a very clear pitch for business, for investors, for voters. Quote from him, "People, to be honest, don't really know what the UK is trying to do or wants to be these days." He says that Labour's first offer to business, the city and inward investors is political stability. He's not wrong. How do you gain voter trust once more?
Well, I think what I would respond to that is we have clearly got an agenda for high growth. We've identified 5 key sectors for growth, and we're putting in place, consistently policies that will help us achieve growth, whether it's workforce participation or stimulating business investment. We have acted under very difficult circumstances as a government through 2 global shocks in the last couple of years to stand by businesses, stand by families and individuals. We are the party of government who stands by people. I think people will recognise that when that comes to the election next year. But we have to ensure that we make people's lives easier when it comes to the cost of living, and that's why we are tackling inflation. That's why we are putting in place the policies for growth. And I think, again, what we don't agree with is constant spending commitments that would require significant more borrowing. 28 billion on climate change policies every single year is what Labour would do, and we don't believe that's right. Classic Labour Party policy is to rack up debt and leave the country with higher unemployment than when they left. They've never left office with higher employment. They've always left office with higher unemployment. We just don't believe that's right, and I think the British people will, remember that.
Well, talking of Labour, there's a kind of reflection on Gordon Brown and selling gold at the bottom of the market. This is coming from Columbia Threadneedle. Obviously, you know them well. Saying that the Bank of England, Gareth, saying that the Bank of England's quantitative tightening programme is costing the taxpayer billions, and they're comparing it to when Gordon Brown sold gold at the bottom of the market in the early 2000s. You were at Columbia for 14 years. Do you agree with that assessment?
I think the Chancellor's been quite clear. Look, we've got an independent Bank of England. We support the Bank of England in their decision making, but we are engaged very frequently with the Governor, as you would expect, and we monitor these things closely.
So that was the Exchequer Secretary to the Treasury, Gareth Davies, there speaking to me and to Tom Mackenzie on Bloomberg Radio earlier. Look, I think it was very interesting to talk to Gareth Davies, not committing to anything around the pensions triple lock and whether that would disappear or not. He was sort of sticking to the Conservative line that it's in the manifesto, even though we know there's a big debate around this. I think that the revisions to UK GDP allow Davies to be a little bit more positive about the UK economy. Much more difficult, though, when it comes to individual sectors. One of those, I think, is actually farming. And we had a long conversation this morning with the farming minister about the difficulties of the UK post-Brexit.
I think it is one of the benefits of Brexit, genuine benefits of Brexit, that we are now in control of that border, that we can actually implement more checks.
But we're not.
We can actually.
But we're not implementing.
Well,
the point being, the EU has exactly what it had before. Nothing has changed. We are facing a lot more friction with outbound, and we are not having the checks on inbound, as per what the Food Standards Agency.
But the point is that we do now.
So that was the NFU President Minette Batters in conversation with Mark Spencer, who joins us now. Minister, thank you so much for your time on Bloomberg Radio. Does the government have a message that you think will be better received by farmers and growers today?
Yeah, I think our relationship with UK farmers is very positive. We are going through a change. We're moving in a different direction from direct payments to supporting farmers to deliver environmental outcomes as well as produce great British food. And I think, any change can be difficult to deliver and difficult to deal with if you are trying to run a farm and you've got used to a traditional system of support. But moving in that direction now, I think British farmers now are signing up to that and understand what we're trying to deliver and are enthusiastic to try and get on board and support.
Part of this campaign is a new Buy British campaign. Is that really going to make any material difference, asking consumers to buy British?
Well, I think it is quite important. I acknowledge that it's somewhat symbolic, but I think making sure that we are supporting UK farmers, and the consumer can do that very well. And I think it's not just about supporting them because they're British. I mean, actually, we're producing some of the best quality food anywhere in the world. That's done with the highest welfare standards, with the lowest environmental impact. There are many, many good reasons to support British farming, not just because it tastes better than other food around the world.
I know, but that can all be undercut if the imports from the EU, for example, are not subject to checks. Look, without EU-level subsidies here in the UK, British farmers can't compete effectively with subsidised European food exports. There are numerous UK schemes that are meant to replace the EU money, but the complaint has been that money is not being paid to farmers quickly enough or sizably enough. Is there going to be any change, any plan to speed up payments?
Yeah, so we're announcing today that we are bringing forward those payments. Obviously, the new Sustainable Farming Incentive opens on Monday. Lots of farmers have expressed an interest in getting involved in that scheme. But in the meantime, we've already running countryside stewardship that helps farmers look after their land in an environmental way and invest in infrastructure. We've also done a series of grants to help them invest in new technology and in equipment to make them more productive and as well as more profitable. So, and to be clear, the £2.4 billion budget that we had when we were members of the European Union still is ring-fenced and is there to support UK agriculture and to make us more productive.
So that was the Farming Minister, Mark Spencer, speaking to Stephen Carroll and I earlier. Look, I think it's really fascinating that the Farming Minister there was effectively admitting that the campaign that the government is launching today, this Back British Farming Day, was part of that, encouraging UK consumers to buy British produce, if they're shopping online or whatever, that it's symbolic pretty much more than anything else, that UK farming is in the midst of these really difficult changes. I mean, perhaps on the flip side, Mark Spencer and Therese Coffey were laughed at and derided at the last National Farmers Union event that was in February. So, perhaps they're being a little bit more cautious in how they try to sell the government's plan now.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, farmers are one of those constituents like the pensioners who are traditionally rock-solid Tories, but I think it's been a difficult few years for farmers because of Brexit. Many of them, of course, voted for Brexit, but the shortage of workers we saw, particularly straight after we left the EU when we changed the migration rules, were a real problem for farmers. Although it has to be said that the government did backtrack on that quite rapidly and allow more workers in, not pleasing a lot of people who voted for Brexit, but that did ease that crisis. But it was very tricky for farmers in that immediate period. So whether relations have fully recovered between farmers and the Conservative Party, I think that is really the interesting question.
So we've had two ministers then speaking to us this morning. Let's get some analysis now from our senior government reporter, Alex Wickham. Alex, great to have you with us. Look, is the UK government struggling to sell its message, to get its point across? What's going on?
It has been a really tough year for Rishi Sunak. There's no getting away from it. Politically, economically, he's not in a good space right now. If you speak to people in Number 10, they say, look, this is the natural cycle of both politics and the economy. We're in a difficult phase on growth, on inflation, and politically we're, 18 months, a year-ish out from an election. Those are traditionally not places where it's easy for a government to get a good message out there. However, the glimmer of hope that they have in Number 10 is that the cycle sort of continues, and in a few months' time, say 6 months' time, inflation has come down. There is a little bit more growth, etc., and people feel a little bit better off. The headlines aren't quite so bad, and at that point they can start to get a bit more of a positive message out there. It's a sort of a long, slow grind to get through these sort of difficult months before that happens. I mean, easier said than done, but that's what they think in Number 10.
We've had two bold policies floated, haven't we? One is kind of ditching the triple lock or tweaking the triple lock, and one is not uprating benefits in line with inflation. Both of these are hugely controversial, aren't they? Do you think either of them have got much chance of happening?
I mean, the reality is the government needs to find money. The public finances are in a bad state. The government needs, the Tory party needs to offer voters something at the next election in the form of tax cuts. And it needs to create wedges with the Labour Party that can make Tory voters, typical Tory voters, come out and say there is actually a reason for me to go to the polls, rather than just say, oh, the government's been rubbish, I can't be bothered. And they have highlighted, and ironically, those two policy areas that you mentioned, benefits and pensions, kind of pull in the opposite direction, because pensioners are the core vote of the Conservative Party. If you wind up the pensioners, if you annoy the pensioners, that is an absolute key target audience for the Tories. So messing with that historically has been seen as absolutely unthinkable for any Conservative strategist. The flip side is benefits, where, typically not Tory voters, and it could create a bit of a wedge because it puts Labour in a tricky position. Labour, you would have thought, should be defending the poorest people in the country, and many other voters might think that benefits have gone up, with inflation in the last year, and as a result, that is something that could be targeted. So, will they happen? I mean, the government seems to be flying a bit of a kite at the moment on these policies. I think they are looking at the reaction and seeing how it lands, and ultimately they need to find savings somewhere.
But that's the bit that I want to focus on. I mean, that's sort of extraordinary in and of itself, that these huge policy changes, these Conservative manifesto commitments and kind of benchmark commitments to voters are now all of a sudden being discussed. Yes, okay, we're a year out from an election. But I think when you're trying to make the argument, that you are now a competent government under Rishi Sunak, floating ideas seems like a very tentative, uncertain thing to do. Am I wrong in thinking that?
I don't think so. And, Rishi Sunak's been criticised by people in his own party for not being a decisive Prime Minister, and somebody who, even the sort of political reset that was supposed to happen in September kind of got shoved back a bit because it didn't appear like he really had much of a plan for that. And absolutely on the policy front, they consult a lot. They often take their time on things and tinker rather than make big decisions. If you look at the last budget, it was pretty underwhelming. I think for most Conservatives, certainly they wanted some more fireworks and they didn't get them. And if we look at the autumn statement coming up, we're told by Jeremy Hunt, it's not, don't get your hopes up. It's another tough one. Maybe the spring budget next year is when the Tories have no choice but to announce something bold and interesting, because at that point it's the last throw of the dice.
Labour has a poll lead of 20 points, give or take. Governments are unpopular midterm. But is there a sense amongst Tory MPs that the road is starting to run out, that the path to the general election is looking more and more tricky?
Yeah, and last couple of weeks in September, they were hoping, Tory MPs, for a bit more of a punchy and upbeat number 10 that was getting on the front foot. It hasn't quite happened yet, I think it would be fair to say. However, it is important to say a lot can happen in a year, and the Tories do expect the polls to narrow a bit. It is obviously an extremely tall order with everything that happened under Liz Truss and Boris Johnson. It was always a tall order for Rishi Sunak to be able to win the next election. But they are starting to think, and I do think there's been a bit of a shift in number 10, which is from sort of let's try and make the best of a bad situation and mitigate defeat. They've got a bit of a taste for it now, some of those advisors in there, and some of them are saying, actually let's go for it and let's just throw out all the stops and try and turn this around. Easier said than done, but they will go for it.
Yeah, and I think that I detected that glimmer of a little bit more hope from Gareth Davies speaking to us because of the upgrading of the growth data, revising up UK growth, and the government had been hit so many times with that idea of the UK being the worst performer in the G7 and that no longer being true, even if it's only temporarily. Is perhaps that window of hope. Look, let's end then on a thought on the Labour Party and not forget that they've also been out and about, like at the TUC conference. We're coming up to party political season now. With that 20-point lead, what's Labour doing with it?
Well, Labour's strategy, perhaps correctly, because you can't argue with a 20-point lead, has been, over the last few weeks and months, to basically say, here's what we're not going to do, and, not give anything for the Tories to attack, and be very cautious and very defensive, and just say, look, we're not the Tories are rubbish. Remind voters of the record of the Conservative Party over the last few years. That's been Labour's strategy. That will have to change a bit. And the reality is, Labour, will have to say over the next year something that is a bit more interesting and inspiring for voters. And to be fair, they have the beginnings of some policies that could be ambitious on house building, on the future of the workplace in Britain and workers' rights. Things like net zero by 2030, green transition and the future economy. And it's those sorts of things that we're going to need to hear a bit more from Keir Starmer over the next few months. Because otherwise the Conservatives will pivot to a strategy of saying, look, voters, look forward. What's Starmer offering you? Not very much. And the Tories have nothing to lose. They can come up with all sorts of bold ideas at this point.
Yeah. Alex, thank you so much for being with us. That is our senior government reporter, Alex Wickham. So great to have you on the programme. Ewan, I really think that actually the next few weeks, we raise benefits and we raise the idea of pensions. I think all of the debate, from my perspective, is around taxes. Which taxes, how much room is there either to cut taxes, which is the wish, or the reality of potentially having to raise taxes. I think it's just all about the money.
It's all about money, isn't it? It's a subject that we like talking about, and it is absolutely central to political debate in this country. And of course, it's not just central for the Tories, it's also very central for Labour, who want to spend more money, but frankly have got very few options to raise it, and they've been ruling some of those out. So it's a difficult debate for both parties.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's it from us for today. We didn't bring you Prime Minister's questions. We had too many ministers to hear from. Thanks so much for listening. If you like this programme, don't forget to subscribe. Give it 5 stars so that other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by James Walcock, and our audio engineer was Maruful Hussain. I'm Yuan Potts.
And I'm Caroline Hepker. We'll be back with more tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.